So, in what we're going to talk about today is vocabulary and semantics in child-directed language in the sketch. Uh, do, do, do. Um, so let me just fix something up here. Yeah, so word-like units are the child's initial target for verbal communication. So insofar as children see language as communicative, they seek to identify mappings between form and meaning. So I think that's pretty uncontroversial. But what counts, obviously, as a word in a language is going to differ across different topologies. So, for instance, if we can compare Mandarin to Morimpata, words in Mandarin obviously depend on the tonal system, whereas words in Morimpata, especially the verb, is going to be heavily dependent on the complex morphology of the language. So, in anyone's sketch, you're going to have to think about how the lexicon interacts with other components of language, and we'll see some examples of that later on in the presentation when we look at Inuktitut. So basically, the typology of a language means a lexicon has different relationships to other domains of language. And then when we're thinking about words in or in child-directed language, we also have to think of the possibility that a language might have what we've referred to in the sketch manual as a nursery vocabulary. So modifications of adult words that are directed to children for using various phonological kind of transformations or sometimes wholly different words. Um, so here are the various things that we've talked about when we're that we've recommended people address when we're looking at at lexicon and semantics in both child-directed language. And I've also included here child language, which we'll talk about in January, but I wanted to put both of these up here because as we'll see, we've sort of recommended that people do write about different things in child-directed language and child language, but the one sketch that we have published on Inuktitut actually combined these, and it's probably not a bad idea to think about combining them anyway. So in the child-directed language, we've said in the core components to consider whether there's a nursery vocabulary, and we'll come to that in a moment. And if yes, what are its structural properties and which words have replacement nursery lexemes? And what do adults and other children talk about to younger children? The extensions, which is something that in the Nutut sketch was done, which is what are the distribution of semantic fields, and is there a preference of talking about the present time and location? So in child language, we've said what is the distribution of word classes and semantic fields across development. So you already see the connection to the child-directed language. And in the Inuktitut sketch, Shanley and I can't remember her first name, her second name's Lee, so Lee and Alan looked at the distribution of word classes as well, which we'll come to later on. Secondly, what's the relative distribution of nouns to verbs across development, which they looked at, and what do children begin to use, when do children begin to use other word classes? Finally, in the core, do you observe any patterns of truncation of words? We'll come to that in the next sketch meeting, and which ones and at which ages. Finally, the extension is what additional observations can be made about children's semantic development given the language and the data. But let's just concentrate on child-directed language for today. So what we have here is from Rebecca's work on Pitjantjatjara, which is listed in the sketch manual, I think the second part of the sketch manual. And so this is an example of Pitjantjatjara a nursery lexicon. So what we can see here is there's a bunch of adult forms, its corresponding nursery form, its English translation, and the kind of phonological substitutions that are made on the adult form to produce the child or the nursery form. So what you can see here is some of the nursery forms, such as Nyaya. I hope I pronounced that right, Rebecca. If not, you'll tell me later. Um, are closely related to the adult form, whereas some are much less related. So you can see down here with the nursery form for water, upper is a little bit different from the adult form kapi. So What we recommend in the sketch is that people look for nursery vocabulary, and I'll give you some examples as well from Inuktitut in a moment. Uh, but it's important to remember that these might not always be evident in your sketch corpus, so in the data. So what we also recommend is that people speak to community members about the use of nursery vocabulary and ask them to provide examples. You might not get an exhaustive number of exhaustive list when you're asking people to provide examples, but nonetheless, this will perhaps give you some examples that don't end up appearing in your corpus itself. So here's some examples from the Inuktitut sketch as well. And so not all of these examples came from the Inuktitut sketch corpus, but because Shanley had been working on Inuktitut for some time, she had a whole bunch of examples that she had collected over time, and probably also that were evident in her larger corpus. So, in general, I won't go through any of the examples here, but what the patterns were was that they're simple. The nursery forms are simpler phonologically, and in affixation, with Inuktitut being a polysynthetic language. And some of them don't necessarily have phonological similarity to the adult root, so suggesting that they are really a unique register here. What they did is they analyzed the use in the sketch corpus of the nursery vocabulary roots in their data, and as you might expect, what they found is that the use of nursery vocabulary diminishes with development. So their corpus started at 1 year and 4 months, and went up to 3 years and 4 months. And what they found is that after the age of 2, they didn't find any nursery forms appearing in their sketch corpus. So what we recommend for nursery vocabulary is you to think about what are its structural features. Are they derived from standard lexemes? If so, how? If not, then that should also be indicated. Are they, for instance, onomatopoeia? What concepts do they denote? And in what contexts are they used and by whom? So, as we saw in the Inuktitut example, they're used pretty much more regularly with very young children, but as children get older, they're used much less often. Although it's very difficult with the sketch corpus being only 5 hours to say that the absence of something is going to mean that they're no longer used with children over the age of 2. They probably still are. So that's the nursery vocabulary. And now we'll move on to semantic fields. So this isn't in the core component of child-directed language, but it's probably a good idea to think about these in child-directed language, because then if you're going to look at what children are producing and they're acquiring in terms of the semantics and the form of the words in the lexicon, then it's good to know what is happening in the input. And sometimes children are replicating the input, but in those instances where children differ from the input, this is quite indicative of, say, for instance, some biases in development, which we'll come to when we talk about the noun bias. So the content of conversation is going to have both universal and culturally specific themes. So in many respects, the early experiences of children are common because we're all human, and all young children are dependent on their caregivers. And so there'll be references to concepts involving things like eating, sleeping, family, and other things which parents and children love to talk about, which is things like toileting, for instance. But there'll also be obviously culturally specific concepts because cultures and environments vary, and as do child rearing practices. So when it comes to the distribution of semantic fields in child-directed language, what we've recommended as a starting point is to not reinvent the wheel here, but to take the semantic fields from the Carther Bates communicative development inventory. If we want to talk about what that is, we can do that after the presentation. But if you take the semantic fields from the MacArthur-Bates CDI to categorize the distribution of word meaning in the input. And this is what was done in the Inuktitut sketch. So in the CDI, which is a parental checklist where parents check a whole bunch of words that their children say or comprehend or simply say. And it's divided into a whole bunch of semantic fields. So here are some examples from the Inuktitut sketch. I think in the Inuktitut CDI there are something like 21 semantic fields, but Shanley and I think it's Hannah Lee reported on I think 16 different semantic fields here. So these are things like baby words, animals, vehicles, toys and games, food and drink, clothing, body parts, household items, furniture, rooms, places to go, people, action words, descriptive words, dexis, social conventions, and then an all-encompassing other semantic field. So here are some examples from Inuktitut of these semantic fields in the MacArthur-Bates CDI. If there isn't a CDI in the language, which let's face it, there might not be. I think it's the use of the semantic fields across the adaptations of the CDI are often fairly similar, and so it's completely okay to look at a CDI in an existing CDI to look at the semantic fields that have been used, and then to use those particular semantic fields to code the lexical items in your corpus according to those. So what did they find in the Inuktitut sketch? So here's the proportion of semantic fields in the Inuktitut child-directed language across the different age points in the sketch. So what we can see pretty clearly is that a good proportion of the data are uh, only denote a subset of these semantic fields. So action words, dexis, social conventions, and people. So this makes up a great deal, or a majority of this child-directed language is taken up by these small amount of categories. And this is likely to reflect many things in the data. It could be due to the small data set. It could be the focus on the here and now in the recordings and in child-directed language in general. We're talking about what's going on using verbs, but also using deexis to refer to things in the environment. It could also denote social routines with the use of social conventions and references to people. So we don't know if this will replicate in other sketches, but this is a kind of interesting phenomenon where the semantics of the child-directed language in the Inuktitut sketch are quite skewed to a subset of these particular categories. So moving on finally to word classes. So the distribution of syntactic categories in child-directed language and in children's speech has long been of interest to researchers. This is largely because the distribution of syntactic categories or the availability of these forms and input is the raw ingredients for children's acquisition. It's the raw ingredients on which they use to build their language, to construct their language. And the difference between children's linguistic behavior, as I referred to previously, and their input is revealing about constraints on learning. So one common topic in this space has been the so-called noun bias in acquisition. So what we find is robust evidence in many languages for children's early vocabularies really being dominated by nouns in comparison to other prominent syntactic categories such as verbs. So we find this in languages like Dutch, English, French, Hebrew, Italian, Korean, and Spanish. But as the field has diversified the languages that has looked at, there's less robust evidence in other languages for this noun bias. So one recent one is from Marissa Casillas and her work on Celtal, and there has been prominent debate over the years too in Mandarin and languages like Korean and Japanese as to whether or not there is a noun bias as well. So we recommend reporting on the distribution of word classes in child-directed language because when you come to look at when the word classes that children are acquiring and using frequently or less frequently, then you might be able to say something about whether or not children have a focus on nouns in your language over other types of syntactic categories, and also whether or not there is this differential between the input and the children's uptake, which may give you some evidence to suggest whether or not children are not always following their input in acquisition. So this is from the Inuktitut sketch here. So what they found in the input is that there's a pretty good distribution of verb roots and noun roots, pretty even distribution of verb roots and noun roots in the input to children. So what they've done here, of course, in Inuktitut being polysynthetic, is they've not looked at what we would think of as an individual noun or verb. They've looked at the roots because it's a highly inflected language. So therefore, when you're thinking about doing this in your language, it's important to think about the typological properties of the language in order to do this in a sensible way. So in the Inuktitut sketch, they looked at roots rather than the surface form, since word class can change many times within the polysynthetic word. So the important thing here is for verb roots and noun roots, there's an equal distribution. So 36% of types, for instance, in when children were 1 year and 4 months, and 34% noun roots in for types at the age of 1-4. I'll just say that LR stands for localizer root, and IACT stands for interactive expressions. These things might not be clear to everyone. So the distribution looks fairly even, at least between verbs and nouns across, particularly when we look at tokens, across development. So one would mount a hypothesis, I suppose, that if children are attending closely or following their input closely, and they didn't have a noun bias, then they might have an equal distribution of nouns and verbs in their productions. But actually, what they found in the Inuktitut sketch is that Inuktitut-speaking children produce 2 times more noun roots than verb roots during their acquisition, suggesting that there might be a noun bias in Inuktitut. This could be for many reasons. It could not just simply be because nouns are conceptually simple. It might have something also to do with the morphological complexity of nouns versus verbs in the language. Okay, so this has been a sort of a short presentation on the lexicon and semantics in child-directed language for the sketch, but here's a summary. So in your sketch of vocabulary and semantics, what we recommend is that you describe the nature and structure of nursery vocabulary, if it exists. So it's important to say we've shown examples of nursery vocabulary in Pitjantjatjara and Inuktitut, but for instance, in another language that that we collectively work on in Murimpata, there's less evidence that there's a nursery vocabulary, and Lucy will confirm or deny that once I unshare my screen, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. The second one is to describe the semantic fields of words in the input, and the third is to analyze the distribution of word classes in the input. So I'll stop sharing now, and we're happy to open things for discussion. That is right.
Absolutely right. Yes, I was about to say you're absolutely right. Yeah. Like some caregivers modify the occasional word, but that's about it. There's no dedicated nursery vocabulary that any of us have come across.
Great. Cool. So does anyone have any questions or comments? Maybe while you're thinking, Rebecca, do you want to maybe describe the process of creating the nursery vocabulary for Pitjantjatjara?
Yeah. So I was in a good position actually, in that it was actually the only aspect of child-related language which had been described a bit before I started working on the language. It had really stood out to a lot of people working with the community, and it had been really prominent in the kind of education context and building materials for the school. And because in the community, there's a general like use of nursery vocabulary by children is really well tolerated, expected up until about the age of 4 or 5. And then after that, there's an expectation that children will graduate to the adult forms. And that, of course, coincides with starting school age. And so there's a lot of talk in the school system about children who are still using the nursery vocabulary and then what is the nursery vocabulary and that sort. And so when I started working on it, there were a few lists of items that had been collected by people working in the community and in the schools. And also there was a dictionary of Pitandara and a lot of the nursery vocabulary, or there are a lot of nursery vocabulary items listed in the dictionary. And so I worked with those lists and sat down with community members and talked to them about talking with children and did they use these words and what are other examples and exactly kind of made that more extended list from those lists and examples that people gave me. I liked your point about how you might not see many of these in the sketch data, because even though it's really pervasive in child-directed speech in Pitandara, not many of them actually show up in the sketch. And that's, I think, just the small data size and the range of contexts that are captured in those particular recordings, and they're not necessarily going to be talking about those particular other items. Yeah. So making those lists and talking with community members was really valuable for them.
Yeah, and I guess that's also that's the reason why the sketch is sort of like a combination of, excuse me, documentation and sort of child language research, right? So so talking to the community about these forms is a good way to get some extra data without the heavy burden of hoping that it pops up in your report.
Yeah. And it's also something that people are often really conscious of and aware of. If you give them a few examples, then it's often really easy for them to go, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about, and here's 10 more.
Does anyone have any questions then? Shivo.
I was wondering about those nursery words. About, I guess the question sort of leans towards phonology again, about what words are chosen to have those nursery forms. Like, do they have longer syllables? Do they have certain consonants that's hard for children to produce? Maybe they acquire those consonants at a later age. For example, if they have really fine-grained contrast in the coronal space, maybe the retroflex is picked, maybe one of them is picked. And I just quickly had a glance before the slides swapped over, but I saw it seems like the palatal seems to be favored, which looked a bit weird to me because sometimes I think the kids, if I remember correctly, they acquire the bilabials first. So I assumed that you would see lots of bilabials in those spaces, but in fact there was lots of palatal nasals, and I wasn't quite sure why that was happening.
Yeah, was that in Pittenjar? Maybe Rebecca
I
can
think so.
lights into this.
Yeah. I was just going to ask you, and if you wanted me to talk about that, or if you wanted. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think it is probably going to depend on the language. And in some languages, I suspect that the nursery vocabulary will be more phonologically driven. And in others, it will be more isolated to particular lexical items. And in Pitandara, it's kind of combination, which is probably likely to find in many cases, where it certainly targets, so the adaptations target consonants that are seen as difficult for children, and they are adapted. And so a lot of the adult adaptations are mirroring adaptations that children make in their own productions. So consonant harmonization, reduction of consonant clusters, and these sorts of things that the children are doing in their own speech and that are really common cross-linguistically in child productions. But it's definitely not the case that all words with such consonants get adapted in this way. So it's not a blanket adaptation of those phonological, those clusters, those issues. But it is certainly, at least in Pitandara, trying to make things easier for the children. And the adults talk about how they're speaking in that way so that it's easier for the children to understand, that by talking to children in the way children talk, then you're meeting them at their level, and you're increasing the chances, like improving the communication. It is interesting that they target the palatal, and they definitely really seem to push things. There's a lot of palatalization. And there is certainly a stage that I've seen in the child productions where the children often palatalize consonants. But initially they seem to reduce to the alveolar. So yeah, there's a bilabial first, but then they're reducing to the alveolar. But there has all these places of articulation. And then they're reducing the retroflex and the palatal to the alveolar.
So Eve's going to jump in here. So
yeah. Just a very quick comment, and that is Ferguson, when he wrote his original paper on baby talk, pointed out that parents would always say that they were using simpler things which were simple for children to pronounce, but they weren't in fact always simpler for children to pronounce. So parents are not necessarily good judges in any one language about what will be easy, what will be hard for a 10-month-old, a 1-year-old, a 1.5-year-old. So I think that often you find discrepancies between what would be simpler and what the nursery words actually are.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a great example of that, where in many ways they are targeting things which are simpler in reducing the consonant clusters and in harmonizing the consonants and things. But then they're doing this palatalization, which is not easier for the children. And that's really regular. It's really frequent to have this palatalization in the nursery vocabulary.
Thanks. I guess that also brings up the issue of like when you're marking children's speech, whether they are producing it right or not. Like if it's a nursery word and the parents would probably nod and be like, yes, you got it right, but then it's totally different from the adult form. And then, because I've always been wondering, I was like, would the adults think that they're doing the right thing if they do this like with a slightly difference, that it just gets complicated, I guess.
Yeah, and then it's variance and what's seen as acceptable versus not. That's interesting. I think maybe it has some interesting work on kind of when it crosses the threshold and caregivers will correct Phuket speaking children. And it's like, no, that's definitely wrong. We're going to correct that one. But no, these ones are fine.
Yeah, and I think these changes, I think someone referenced, I think maybe it was Rebecca. There's probably some language specificity here and what goes on. So I know that we Abdul, a student in Nijmegen, is looking at Berber, which has very complex consonant inventory, and is finding that the parents often neutralize contrasts. So some kind of making it a little bit more difficult to find all the parts of the phonological space and they're not always reliably doing it as well, this neutralization. Some parents do it all the time and some do it sometimes. Um, so yeah, it's there's likely a high degree of language specificity here on what's going on, but maybe connected to ultimately a folk theory of language simplification for the infant, but not necessarily always being simplifying or simple for the infant.
Mhm.
Mhm. Any other questions or comments? Shippo, go for it.
Another one. I was thinking about word
Class. I haven't done much research on it, so it's probably pretty naive. I was thinking how people were counting like more nouns than verbs and such, but then I was thinking, would it be like slightly more fair if we compare those child-directed speech to normal adult speech? Like maybe there are just more nouns than verbs in the language instead of just being in the child-directed speech. Maybe just the percentage is higher, or is it just a pure count in child-directed speech?
Yeah, I guess
Maybe
what
I'm
we were saying was that if there's a difference between what the children are hearing directed to them and what they end up producing, then that difference may point to, say, for instance, something like a noun bias. But you're right, it's important to be able to know what the distributions are uh, in the adult language in general versus the adult language to children. Although I guess my suspicion is that may not be hugely different, although I could be very wrong. Actually, there might be more provisions of nouns. It didn't seem to be the case in Nuktitut, at least. But yeah, it would having adult language would definitely give you more of an understanding of how child-directed language may differ in general in the distributional properties. That's for sure.
But you probably won't be able to do that in the sketch data.
No, unless you've got
So don't get too ambitious.
And just something I saw the other day just came out randomly. I think they were saying like people in a relationship who are like in a really good relationship sort of talk to each other sort of like baby talk. And I was like, I wonder if they use those nursery words as well, but who knows?
Well, there's this Dennis Burnham did some fun studies, well, many years ago now, probably 20 years ago, where he was looking at uh, what you might call baby talk or something like that to animals, right? And found that the that baby talk to animals that are capable of vocalizing, like parrots, for instance, did have different properties than baby talk directed to like dogs who have no chance of being able to vocalize, right? To learn. So suggesting that that there is a kind of maybe sort of a pedagogical intention if you expect something to come back. I can't remember what the difference was in baby talk to parrots versus animals versus dogs, for instance. But yeah, we certainly engage in it with other conspecifics or conspecifics other than children.
Yeah, and when we were chatting the other day about like talking to kids and pets, and some people said, "Oh, I can't do baby talk in English because it's not my native language." And I thought that's really interesting, like what makes people be able to figure out what to say to kids in one language? Like, how much nativeness does it actually take?
Mhm. Yeah, Caroline's just said a comment here that she said there's some fun phonetic phonological literature on dog-directed speech. Several similarities with English child-directed speech, but without, I think, the vowel lengthening or something.
Um, I think your point, Chuba, about can you do child-directed language in a non-native language is really interesting. One, because it's it's certainly something that you're acculturated into, and uh, it's not something that you're taught in a language class typically. But also, I find it interesting in the, I guess, individual and cultural variation in whether people would just kind of import their own style into, like, from one language into another language, but also where languages and communities where talking directly to children is less, and particularly babies who aren't talking yet, is seen as less of a thing to do than it is in some other societies. And then that can be really interesting in a kind of, well, why would you talk to this being who can't talk back kind of way, as another kind of reason why some people might struggle with child directed. And of course, like, then there's a kind of cultural folk theory of, well, you don't talk to them until they can talk back. But of course, people are talking around them and to them and so on in the community. It's just that's the conscious idea that you wouldn't do that.
Any other questions, comments, discussion points? Okay, if not, thanks for coming. Oh, Eve, yeah.
I have one question. I missed the very beginning of your talk, Evan, so you may have covered this, but how much in the sketch data do people check on infants' comprehension of what they're hearing?
Yeah, we're really sticking to the productions, to be honest. I guess.
Right, that's what I was wondering about.
Yeah, because we haven't. I guess the only way you could do it is in when you're talking to community members about children's general development and
Yeah.
just ask, how do you know children are understanding language, and at what age do they begin to understand various parts?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there would be very simple things that one could do, like asking a child to fetch a particular object and see whether they actually get it or not. But that's much harder to do with 1-year-olds.
Yeah. And I guess too, like the sketch is sort of built so that it could be done with like a small number of children.
Right.
And of course we're looking at their productions, that's fine. And then I guess getting their comprehension, it's still just as valid, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I think it's still doable. And the question is, what would be the simplest way to check on their comprehension? Asking them to carry out very simple commands is one way. And we've used that a lot, but in experimental settings. And I guess the youngest we've gone is, well, between 1 and 1.5. We've actually done quite a bit, but I think it's important because comprehension is typically ahead of their production. And so they may not say particular words, but they may well understand them already.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's the thing where it's the sort of invisible part, if you like, of very early acquisition. And but I think that's one reason to think perhaps about ways that bits of it might be checked up on as well.
Yeah, one thing that we did talk about uh, across the time when we were writing the sketch was, would it be possible to have some kind of word list, right? A word list of like common cultural concepts that you could say do, and to ask the parents, maybe not necessarily like a huge list itself, not like a huge CDI, but
Right.
try and come up with a bunch of at least a bunch of common cultural concepts, but then potentially also have some allowance for culturally specific concepts as well. To be able to say, what are the children's first words, and what do they understand, and things like that, to
Yeah.
get
Right.
some idea of what you're talking about. And with that kind of I guess we left that to the side. It would still be a really interesting um, project to be able to think of I think what we were thinking was like a Swattish list for that could
Right.
be, yeah, that could be
Shorter than Swedish
yeah,
flaps.
exactly right. Yeah, yeah. Maybe a list of say of 50 words that could also be added to, given that there will be,
Right.
like I said, some a variation culturally in what people care about and what's around them.
Right.
Yeah, we talked about doing this in terms like within a kind of parent interview.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Tell us about your child's language acquisition.
Hmm.
I think, yeah, that would be a really good idea. But also, I wanted to comment, we've kind of started doing a bit of this with the Bidendera data, looking at children's responses to adult utterances within
Right.
the sketch. So there's a lot of directive in the adult productions within the sketch. And so then looking at, well, how are the children responding to those? Are they doing those things? So we've been looking at it for perception verbs, and are children, if somebody says to look, are they then redirecting their gaze and
Yeah.
these sorts of things? And often it's probably got more to do with other things rather than comprehension. But it could be interesting to look at these kind of natural fetch experiments within the sketch.
Right. And it gets tricky because you said you were looking at perception verbs, but if you say to a child something like, look at the door, they may know the word door,
Yeah.
not understand look at all.
Yeah.
And they will look, but they will look at the door because you've in fact talked about it.
Exactly.
And the adult might have pointed as well at the door.
Yeah. Yeah. And so if they understand the point,
Yes.
which they probably will.
Yeah.
So yeah, it gets very complex. And also there's, it's not just comprehension. There's what is the child already engaged with? What's their interests? Are they wanting to break their activity?
Yeah, the willful ignore. That's a valid
Willful-
response to directives, I think.
Yeah. So getting distracted on the way and coming back with something else.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming. Just a brief announcement for the next session will be January 15th, where we'll be talking more about vocabulary and semantics in children's language. So have a good holiday break, all of you, and I hope you come
You
back.
too.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very much looking forward to mine. I finish this Friday. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.